books, and a book that I'm working on. I'm a professor of Jungian studies and creativity at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and I'm also a ceremonial magician. So I'm putting together a book really showing where these two traditions intersect in the work of Carl Jung. We have people in the audience who are Jungians who know very little about magic, and we have people in the audience who are magicians and know very little about Jung. So if you hear me explaining things a little more than you think you need, that's why. And please bear with me. So during the final years, oops. Okay, are we gonna? There we go. During the final years of his life, Carl Jung commented on the persistence of magic in 20th century Switzerland. So that as I know from my own experience and that of other investigators, he wrote, magic as practiced in the Middle Ages and much remoter times has by no means died out, but still flourishes as rampantly as it did centuries ago. Elsewhere, he told of modern-day sorcerers, including a Swiss peasant he knew near Bollingen, his tower in the countryside, where he told of modern-day sorcerers, one of whom possessed a very old grimoire who had been given to him by a local monk. Little did he know that 60 years later, a vast number of such books, dating back to the Renaissance and beyond, would become increasingly available to both scholars and members of the flourishing community of ceremonial magicians who practice centuries-old traditions such as sympathetic magic, spirit conjuration, and necromancy. So in speaking about Jung's relationship to magic, I'm careful to point out my own positionality. I'm a member of that ceremonial magic community. Magic constitutes one of my important research interests, and it's also where I base my own spiritual practices. So I'm what some would call a magician, a sorcerer, somebody actively practicing rituals drawn from centuries-old grimoires, as well as other documents that were created even thousands of years ago. Now, why would we care what Jung thought about magic? Well, in the Jungian community, many engage in various sorts of magic, whether they're astrology, I Ching, tarot, shamanic practices, etc. They may not always call what they're doing magic, but these practices all fall into the broad category. In the magical or occult community, Jung has always been a source for long-standing argument over whether magic operates through actual spiritual entities and powers, or whether it merely represents aspects of the individual psyche. I say merely here with a grain of salt, because anybody in the Jungian community knows we really hate the words merely. We hate the word only. Those are kind of a dirty word. They're things that are rarely so plain, and we can reduce things too much by these terms. Jung's relationship to magic began at about the age of 15. As a thoughtful teenager, he was troubled by the established religions of his day. His father was a local clergyman. He found them empty and full of contradictions, so he turned to his father's theological library for answers. But even at that young age, he found the arguments lacking. Specifically, he found the books full of fancy drivel that was either a fraud or a specimen of uncommon stupidity. He was really humble, whose sole aim was to obscure the truth. So during this time of struggle, his mother, suddenly and without preamble, he says, urged him to read Goethe's Faust. So opening his family's volume of Goethe would influence Jung for the rest of his life. Well, the story of Faust deserves some attention. Johann Faust was a real person, born in the late 15th or early 16th century. He earned a doctorate in theology at Wittenberg, where he was a contemporary of Martin Luther. But he also studied law, medicine, alchemy, and magic. Between 1539 and 1541, he was allegedly killed when an alchemical experiment exploded in his home, scattering him, frankly, all over the house. Given his areas of expertise, his reputation suffered. He was accused of being a fraud, of being a sodomite, the religious term of the day for gay men. And Martin Luther is believed to have actually said that Faust had chosen to follow the devil and was destroyed by him. The legend of Faust began to grow with books such as Johann Spice's 1587, the history and damnable life of Dr. John Faustus. Various books, pamphlets, and plays were written over the years, leading up to the most famous version, which is by Goethe. Goethe's Faust was educated in all fields of learning as he sought to understand the secrets of the universe. But he was so unable to find satisfaction that he contemplated suicide. At this desperate point, he turned to the so-called dark arts, entering into a pact with Mephistopheles to obtain secret knowledge and magical powers. In the process, Faust proceeded to live a very hedonistic life, placing himself beyond the reaches of redemption and beyond the restrictions of the church. So, as a result, Faust in the original legend fell victim to his bargain, and his soul was dragged down to hell. Goethe, however, adjusted the ending and altered it and put it really back into the tradition of a lot of early Christian writings, where the demonic pact was broken by the intervention of the divine feminine, such as Mary, or in Faust's case, Gretchen. The reality is Jung really disliked this revision. He felt like it cheapened the story. He felt like Faust made a decision and should have borne the consequences of it. Well, Jung wrote that his family owned a handsome edition of Goethe, which included Faust. We don't know what edition the family actually owned. I wish I knew. But various woodcuts have been common in these publications. So, for example, Faust's discovery of a symbol of the macrocosm and a symbol of the earth spirit within the book, attributed to Nostradamus, was commonly illustrated with woodcuts such as this 1652 etching by Rembrandt. Rembrandt used a skull, as you see, to portray Faust as a necromancer, and he illustrated the symbol of the macrocosm as a typical magic circle containing various sacred words and names, such as Agla, which is a magical acronym meaning Ata Gibor Li Olam Adonai, or Thou, O Lord, are mighty forever. In any event, this experience with Faust helped to launch Jung into further reading in philosophy, drama, poetry, history, and other areas. His powerful interest in the legend very likely brought him into contact also with an entire genre of German grimoires that were all attributed to Faust. Along with the family's edition of Faust, these would have exposed Jung to ceremonial magic, including that tradition's powerful use of images. So it should be no surprise that he went on in later years to acquire magical grimoires explicitly claiming to preserve Faust's magical heritage. One of these was Karl Kieswater's 2-volume compilation, Faust in History and Tradition, with special reference to occult phenomenalism and medieval magic, published in 1921. Another was a rare volume, Dr. Johann Faustus Magia Naturalis et Id Naturalis, published by Johann Scheibel in 1849. These works typically were condemned by religious leaders, and they were coincidentally referred to as black books. And that's exactly what Jung called his own diaries, from which he compiled the Red Book that you may have heard of. Jung's interest did not end with the Faustian magic books, though. Jung collected over time several more magic books, books on ceremonial magic. The most important of these was an original 1533 copy of Agrippa's 3 Books of Occult Philosophy, the first edition of which containing all 3 volumes. He also owned the first complete German translation of Agrippa, which appeared in 1916. Now, the same compilation here also contains several other explicit works of magical instruction, such as the 4th Book of Occult Philosophy, the Arbatel, the works of Peter Abano, and the writings of Trithemius. In addition to these, Jung created additional magic books produced by Johann Scheibel. One of these was an excerpt of Kabbalistic material from Agrippa, published in 1855. Others included German translations of the Sacred Magic of Abrenelin, and one of the most rare is actually the 6th and 7th Books of Moses. The latter became, of course, an important image among active imaginations, as well as probably one of the most important grimoires to reach the United States in its early history. So all these works included magic circles and sigils that were used for encountering various angels, spirits, and daemons, similar to those found in the Faustian Black Books. The power of magical images to those found in the, power of magical images did not escape Jung's attention. In his 1923 Cornwall seminar, Jung explained, images are energy or libido. This is why the magician makes images, for such things are energy, psychic energy. Inasmuch as a figure makes an impression on you, it releases energy. So Jung also discussed magic circles as an interpretive motif for images produced by his clients, suggesting that similar paintings showed an attempt to protect certain psychic content from either escape or intrusion. One of my dear friends is the director now of the Jungian Picture Archives in Zurich, which is a collection, enormous archive of the images that Jung's clients painted. And many of them show up very much like magic circles. Now, that's something I'll be able to share later. I don't have the full permission to do that yet. Later, Jung would also compare magic circles to mandalas. So it also appears that these books had an impact on those in Jung's immediate circle. Tony Wolff, his gifted collaborator and polyamorous partner, felt a deep connection to ancient Egypt and was even known to dress in Egyptian style for costumed events. This wasn't especially unusual because we're talking about the 1920s, after Howard Carter had only recently discovered the tomb of King Tutankhamun, causing a sensation that, impacted fashion and culture around the world. In January of 1926, Jung was exploring Egypt while on a lengthy tour of Africa. During this time, Wolff recorded in her diary that she had invoked the Egyptian god Thoth during an active imagination exercise, and he taught her how to invoke the Ka, or soul, of another person. So later that month, according to her diary, she attempted to invoke she attempted this ritual in order to invoke Jung's spirit and communicate with him. In doing so, under Thoth's instructions, she called loudly out the formula 3 times, "You Ka, you Ka, you Ka. You Ka of Carl, come here, move into my heart. Space has been made for you. Your Ba expects me, and you should move in." And Wolff reported at least partial success, saying that she received messages from Carl Jung in this way, but she couldn't seem to get him to hear her. So a more complete translation of Tony Wolff's diaries is currently being prepared. It's not ready for release yet, but they do go further into these, and this is something I'll be able to expand upon at a future time. But the important thing is that when you look at these, they are entirely typical of what shows up in the invocation practices within grimoires, such as the fourth book of occult philosophy. For example, in that book, there are instructions to invoke a desired spirit with a gentle and loving enchantment to all the coasts of the world, and to repeat this benevolent approach up to 3 times before moving on to more compulsory means. Jung lived in a time there was particularly renewed interest in the arts of necromancy and ceremonial magic. He was born in 1875, less than 2 months after the death of Eliphas Levi, who was, of course, one of the most influential magicians of the 19th century. He was born less than 3 months before the birth of Aleister Crowley, who would go on to become one of the most influential magicians of the 20th century. So within the first decades of Jung's life, several magical orders were formed. One of these, most famous, was Ordo Templi Orientis, which originated around 1895, but by 1925 was forever associated with the name of Aleister Crowley. In 1926, the same year Tony Wolff was attempting to contact the spirit of Jung across continents, members of the Ordo Templi Orientis broke away to form another obscure group called the Fraternitas Saturni. Jung was very much aware of these movements. He even subscribed to Saturnosis, which was the journal produced by the Fraternitas Saturni. Likewise, these groups were aware of Jung. Aleister Crowley, for example, referenced Jung favorably on more than one occasion in his own writings. Thus far, I've identified at least 57 texts on magic in Jung's personal library, not counting his many additional books that were very specific to alchemy or to Kabbalah. Many of these works are multi-volume, and I found in prior research that Jung only owned 4 books, just by way of comparison, to our earliest human images, coming out of cave art. So you would think that that would attract his attention, but that gives you an idea of how much interest he took in magic. At this point in my own collection, I've been able to collect about 22 of the exact same editions that Jung owned, and about another 11 in later reprints or translations. From my perspective as a practitioner, these works were not the collection of a merely curious scholar. Rather, these were the books that would be gathered by someone who was willing to devote considerable time and money to the subject. Jung's collection of books on magic is what might be expected of a devoted practitioner, or at least an avid student. Knowing that Jung was familiar with ceremonial magic, I've been struck by the role it played in his confrontation with the unconscious, the material and the visions and such that make up the Red Book. Jung engaged his soul in 1914 in an act of imagination, promising to receive whatever she would draw up from the depths. Jung's soul declared to him, "I find painted stones, carved bones of magic signs, talismanic sayings on hanks of leather and small plates of lead, dirty pouches filled with teeth, human hairs, and fingernails, timbers slashed together, black orbs, moldy animal skins, all the superstitions hatched by dark prehistory." So asked whether he would accept this collection, Jung said, "Well, I accept it all. How should I dismiss anything? How do I know if it isn't worth having?" Now, despite Jung's claimed openness, Soul's description to him out of his own psyche illustrates Jung's own attitudes toward what he considered to be primitive. These items were the accoutrements of so-called folk magic. And I hate that term, but it suffices. These were practiced by the less privileged classes up to and beyond Jung's own time. Witch bottles, for example, contained human teeth, hair, and fingernails. They continue to be uncovered near the front doorsteps of buildings throughout Europe. Typically, they're placed as protective amulets against magical attacks and/or thieves, and this tradition continues some places even today. By contrast, Soul next described sheets of parchment with the characters of bygone languages, books full of lost wisdom, hymns and chants of ancient priests, stories told down through the ages, through thousands of generations, all of which she called the treasures of past cultures. So here, the treasures brought forth by Soul would include the Greek magical papyri, which were already discovered and in translation at the time, and which, of course, form a foundation of Western ceremonial magic. These, along with other centuries-old magical writings, came from so-called civilized cultures, respected by Jung and his peers. Ironically, these treasures of all past cultures and all superstitions hatched by dark prehistory really almost make a perfect overlap, because the fact is these were not fully separated practices. There was a great deal of overlap in the practices between different classes and different levels of education and such. So what Soul is describing here shows that Jung had inherited long-standing classist attitudes that artificially divided magicians among the privileged class from the so-called cunning folk of the countryside. With that being true, the following day's act of imagination was especially significant. On January 23rd, 1914, Jung once again entered into conversations with his soul. This time, Soul challenged Jung's concepts of magic by placing it within his grasp in the form of a black rod. This is a mock-up of the rod that Jung saw in his visions. In Jung's visions, many times he turned them into painted art, into drawings, into sculptures. For whatever reason, he did not do this with the black rod. This is something, in, of course, of my research, where the practice of making art actually moves research forward. And so I did, go to the effort of creating this. So the black rod was carved in the shape of a serpent with pearl eyes and a fine gold bangle around its neck. Jung objected, declaring that not only, that he did not believe in magic, but he had the corresponding view that man never stops craving the black art and things that cost no effort. His soul argued to the contrary, that magic was not only effective, but required a sacrifice of solace. Jung needed to step outside the confines of what he called his number one personality, his rational personality, the part of him that wanted to be respected as an empiricist in the world. Jung's anguish at this proposition was evident as he wrote, "I kneel down and receive this messenger of darkness, whatever it wants to be. I've received the black rod. I've taken in the messenger of the night." Jung's black serpent rod is a familiar image to anyone with a passing knowledge of the Exodus myth. But the use of serpent rods goes back much further than in Egyptian magic. As a young person, Jung was deeply interested in Egyptian archaeology, so he may have been familiar with these curved wands. In 1896, for example, a wooden chest was discovered beneath the tomb of Ramses II. Inside the box were various magical papyri and objects, including a bronze serpent wand. The inscription on the chest indicated its ownership by a priestly magician identified as a keeper of secrets. This role of magician as keeper of secrets is personified by Philemon, the retired magician and archetypal wise old man that Jung encountered in his own active imagination sessions just 4 days later. Unable to understand this idea of magic, Jung sought out a great magician in a far country. Where Soul confronted Jung with the black serpent rod, Philemon kept the black serpent rod, along with the 6th and 7th books of Moses we talked about earlier, locked away in a cupboard. It's perhaps significant that Jung allegedly kept the red book in a kitchen cupboard long before his descendants transferred it to a bank safety deposit box for safekeeping. Philemon typified the Egyptian priestly magician known as the keeper of secrets. Perhaps this explains why Jung had a decidedly different approach. Rather than expressing fear, Jung pretended to be almost nonchalant, saying, "Recently I heard something about magic that awakened my interest in this bygone practice." The difference here seems important. Jung's initial reaction to the magic rod reflected Rudolf Otto's classic definition of the numinous, that which is larger than ourselves, more powerful than ourselves, and seemingly beyond our understanding. With Philemon, however, Jung attempted to rationalize magic, reducing it to a definable discipline of study. "I came to you," he told Philemon, "because I heard that you understand the black art. If magic were still taught today at the university, I would have studied it there. But the last college of magic was closed long ago. Today, no professor knows anything more about magic." Well, Philemon did not let Jung go with this easy route. The numinous rejects simple categorization. So, for example, Jung asked Philemon exactly how he used magic to help those around him. "Well, I did it quite simply with sympathy," Philemon responded. At this point, Jung attempted to engage in semantics with Philemon, demanding to know whether this meant by expressing compassion or by superstitious sympathetic means. The very nature of the question, together with what we know about the grimoires Jung owned, showed that Jung knew exactly what Philemon was talking about. Um, and sympathetic magic, as reflected in Agrippa and other early magical writings, refers to the doctrine of correspondences, in which the perceived occult virtues of one object are used to magically influence a target. Philemon rebuffed Jung's dichotomy, answering truthfully that compassion and occult sympathy were both operative in magic. Above all, though, Philemon challenged Jung's rationalism, demanding that he approach the numinous by intuitive means. Philemon gave the sacrifice required for magic a new label in accordance with Jung's rationalism: consistency. You judge everything from the standpoint of your intellect. If you forsake reason for a while, you'll also give up consistency. Consistency is a primary goal of empirical research, partly because it offers the solace of predictability, real or imagined. This notion of consistency, however, is illusory. Jung's encounter with Philemon expanded upon what the soul had already revealed, that the modern conscious attachment to empiricism was one-sided and insufficient. Magic, according to Philemon, happens to be precisely everything that eludes comprehension. Where Jung was concerned with empiricism, psyche demanded that reality be considered through intuition. So, how did this later translate into Jung's theoretical writings. In spite of Soul's lesson, Jung's attitude toward thaumaturgical magic, or for those who are not familiar, thaumaturgy being derived from the Greek words meaning wonder working, remained quite negative. While he gave credence to divinatory forms of magic, such as mediumship, astrology, and the I Ching, magic of creating change in the world around him seems to have been troubling for him. Looking back to Faust, Jung suggested in 1921 that the work of the ceremonial medieval magician was a Promethean defiance of the accepted gods. The magician, for Jung, retained a primitive, pagan unconscious, where he said the opposites lie side by side in their original, undifferentiated state, beyond the reach of sinfulness, but liable, if assimilated into conscious life, to beget evil as well as good with the same daimonic energy. This daimonic energy, as exemplified by Faust, among his many excesses, Faust ultimately created a beautiful city with a palace at its center. To his irritation, however, the vast building project was blemished, in his eyes, by the comparatively humble home of Baucis and Philemon. To say this was a humble home, however, is somewhat misleading. Baucis and Philemon, according to Greek myth, had played host to Hermes and Jupiter, who were in disguise. And as a reward, they transformed the home into a beautiful temple. At the age of 100, Faust was so irritated at the elderly couple's refusal to give up their land that he ordered his men to move them forcibly to new housing in the city. Their efforts, unfortunately, resulted in the death of Baucis and Philemon, trapped in their home as it burned to the ground. Faust's horror at this unintended consequence actually began, or was the impetus, toward his eventual redemption. Jung identified strongly with Faust, to the point of feeling a need to atone for Faust's crime. In a letter to Paul Schmidt, he referred to Philemon and Baucis as the hosts of the gods in a ruthless and god-forsaken age, alluding to how their sanctuary stood in the midst of Faust's rampant drive for progress. This may explain in part why, just as new magical orders were being formed in Europe in 1923, Jung began to build his tower in the countryside at Bollingen. After 48 years of contemplating the character of Faust, Jung carved an inscription above the gates of Bollingen, which translates as Philemon's sign, Faust's repentance. So Bollingen was, in psychological terms, a reversal and redemption of the Promethean defiance of the accepted gods that Jung saw in the magician personality. 20 years later, Jung once again looked to Faust as his prototype of the magician. Writing on the process of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, beyond just the ego, Jung suggested that once the anima or animus was fully assimilated, the ego rose up to claim power, either creating an external, all-powerful God, which was sometimes projected on a psychoanalyst, or else claiming for itself the cosmic powers of the magician. Interestingly, Jung suggested this mana personality, as he called it, could also take the form of the creative artist. Now, this idea of the magician and the creative artist as twin paths is an important one. In a real sense, we can take this idea back to the cosmology that was expressed in the Greek Corpus Hermeticum. In that work, the sage Hermes Trismegistus related a vision in which he received a creation myth in which humans held a remarkably positive role. Pomandrus, the divine being communicating this vision, taught that creation began with the androgyne nous, or mind. The first emanation from this nous was the word, a tangible expression of the divine mind. The second was the craftsman, a being of fire and spirit who created the 7 known heavenly spheres as government over all subsequent creations. Third, the nous gave birth to a man like himself, whom he loved as his own child. The man was most fair. He had the Father's image, and God, who was really in love with his own form, bestowed upon him all his craftswork. And after the man had observed what the craftsman had created with the Father's help, he also wished to make some craftswork, and the Father agreed to this. So the human subsequent creative works enticed nature, and he became nature's lover. As a result, humans became mortal despite simultaneously being divine creator gods in their own right, with power over the elements. This is the power of the magician, what Aleister Crowley called the science and art of affecting change into, excuse me, of causing change to occur in conformity with will. As a practicing magician, I want to illustrate a bit about how this creative spark works in the real world. In 1914, excuse me, in 2014, I'm beating myself here. I traveled with my best friend to Rome, Italy. And right after we had dropped off our bags at our hotel, we went out to explore and soon saw a huge stone staircase. And there were lots and lots of people climbing this huge staircase. And so we figured, okay, there must be something up there because all these people are climbing up and heading for something. So we went to check it out. What we encountered at the top was the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli. It's a very plain-looking building, constructed by various phases from 432 AD to 1475 AD. The real attraction was found inside. The first thing we saw was Michelangelo's beautiful statue of Moses, but the second was an ornate reliquary, allegedly holding the chains with which St. Peter was bound when he was brought to Rome and ultimately executed. Next to the reliquary was a small plaque explaining the miraculous story of how the chains were brought to this church in about 432 AD. Now, the historian in me, with a cynical edge, read the plaque and promptly declared it nonsense. I had a more colorful word than that. At the same time, however, I could not deny that I felt this really huge sense of power from these chains. It was undeniable. As then I realized that the power of this reliquary had absolutely nothing to do with the actual origins of the chains. Instead, it was over 1,000 years, millions of pilgrims coming to this site, venerating these chains, praying before these chains, investing them with psychic energy, making them sacred, making them holy and powerful. So, some of you may have heard Neil Gaiman's masterful novel, American Gods. In this book, the ancient gods of many cultures are approaching war against society's new gods of media, technology, finance, etc. In a dream, the main character was taught about the rise of new gods and the fall of old gods. These are gods who have been forgotten and now might as well be dead. They can be found only in dry histories. They are gone, all gone, but their names and their images remain with us. These are the gods who have passed out of memory. Even their names are lost. The people who worship them are forgotten as their gods. These last priests died without passing on their secrets. Gods die, and when they truly die, they're unmourned and unremembered. So like Peter's chains, the gods live or die based on the attention given to them through the creative power of mere mortals. Ceremonial magicians might call this an egregore, a thought form, a collective energy or psychic energy created by a group of people to accomplish a shared magical goal. The egregore is by definition a circuit with specific tasks, yet it performs these functions by exercising powers that are somehow beyond those of the individual human creators. Once created, the egregore can be called upon by any of the human individual who seeks to employ the entity's defined area of influence. As a magician, I might have readily called upon Hermes in writing this presentation and asked for his silver tongue in delivering it. Whether I have succeeded in that is up to you, as I've stumbled some of my words here tonight. The mythic image of Hermes is thousands of years old, emerging before even the Greek culture with whom we associate him. Millions have prayed to him, millions have created art depicting him. Humans, as divine creator gods, have gifted him with all of his attributes and powers, and many continue to do so. The magical community's argument over whether they're working with spirit entities or psychological states can only truly be answered yes. And this is because every encounter the magician engages in is an act of creation by which images become autonomous living entities. Whether that image is ancient or new, Jung psychology teaches us that our images are alive and autonomous. The imaginal or intuitive is a reality unto itself that cannot be dismissed or ignored. The images, as he wrote, have a life of their own, and the symbolic events develop according to their own logic. Jung learned this during his own active imagination sessions when figures such as Philemon emerged, autonomously from the psyche, but bringing him knowledge that was entirely new to him. So just as Jung had to work with his images as autonomous realities, so does the magician enter into his creative efforts. In this understanding of creation and reality, I would suggest that Jung's misgivings and thaumaturgical magic may have conflicted somewhat with his actual life experience. Two examples come to mind. The first was during a tense meeting with Sigmund Freud. It's well understood that part of the impetus for Jung's later split from Freud was Jung's insistence on taking the numinous aspect of the psyche seriously. Freud seemed fond of ridiculing what he called Jung's spook complex. During their first meeting, Jung pontificated at length against psychic phenomena. Jung found himself experiencing a particular sensation as if his diaphragm was made of red-hot iron and were becoming hot, a glowing fault. This sensation culminated as a nearby bookshelf suddenly emitted a loud cracking noise. When Jung noted this as a so-called catalytic exteriorization phenomenon, say that 3 times fast, Freud scoffed. In response, Jung predicted another such outburst, which occurred immediately in the moment he stated it. My second example is one Jung specifically used to illustrate his concept of synchronicity. While in session with a client who was particularly challenging, she shared a meaningful dream in which she was given a golden scarab. As she did so, Jung heard a tapping on the window nearby. And seeing a large insect trying to enter the room, he oddly decided to open the window. Catching the insect in mid-flight, he discovered that it was a local beetle that strongly resembled the golden scarab. Handing it to his client, he declared, "This is the scarab of your dream." Now, I'm certainly not trying to say that Jung exercised grimoire rituals to have these things happen. I would, however, point out that in both instances, they occurred during psychically powerful states. In the midst of transference and countertransference, Jung himself describes synchronistic events as the coincidence of a psychic state in the observer with a simultaneous objective external event that corresponds to the psychic state or emotion, where there's no evidence of a causal connection between the psychic state and the external event. In these experiences, Jung saw an acausal relationship between events that he considered to be meaningful coincidences. From the perspective of a ceremonial magician, however, these numinous experiences do not appear acausal at all. In each of these events, Jung reported intense psychic states of anger or frustration, which were suddenly and powerfully reflected in his environment. In magical terms, these were clear instances of causing change to occur in conformity with will. The magician intentionally creates powerful psychic states in order to project their will upon the outside world. In hearing the story about Freud's bookshelf, it's one thing to say that Jung's intense psychosomatic response was exteriorized with the first crack, but it's yet another to say the second crack occurred immediately as he proclaimed it would. In the story of the scarab, it's one thing to say that while frustrated with a recalcitrant client, Jung just happened to see a similar local beetle tapping on the window, but he went so far as to open the window, capture the insect, and use it as an effective tool in therapy. Neither story tells us of Jung passively experiencing meaningful coincidences. Rather, they tell us of Jung actively impacting the physical world around him, knowingly or not. These are the experiences of a magician. When Jung retrieved the magic rod in his active imagination of January 1914, I believe the psyche offered him the opportunity to confront the prejudices he had learned from Goethe's Faust. "I kneel down and I receive this messenger of darkness," he wrote. "Whatever it wants to be. You pierce me with unbearable tension. Where in my soul do I shelter you? In my heart? Whoa, should my heart be your shrine, your holy of holies? So choose your place. I've accepted you. What crushing tension you bring with you. Isn't the bow of my nerves breaking? I need to endure it. I've taken in the messenger of the night. Jung is the grown man whose psyche manifested in the form of the retired magician Philemon seemingly dreaded the fate of the damnable Faust, whom he encountered as an impressionable 15-year-old. Jung was wary of magic and seemingly attributed it to a so-called primitive psyche, but we cannot simply conclude that Jung rejected it entirely. Tony Wolff's 1926 diary entry that I told you about, referred to earlier, seems to hint at his active participation in rituals of invocation. He went on to collect books on magic, including alchemy, throughout his life. A further examination of Jung's work, taking into account the lens of ceremonial magic, promises to offer greater understanding of his theories, including that of synchronicity. As Aleister Crowley once commented, in Jung's work, we see science gracefully bowing her maiden head before her old father, magic. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts? It's a lot of material, I know. Please.
So Jung attributed a lot of the events that you specified, these kind of metaphysical events, to a connection with the collective unconscious.
Right.
So where do you think the collective unconscious ties into your idea of magic or his understanding?
Sure. Well, to take it just a little bit further, Jung talked about the psychoid, which really was this idea of not just the collective unconscious, but really a connection between all of creation. He would refer to the anima mundi, the world soul. And so all of these actions, all creativity, all activity itself has a telos, has an ultimate end. And all these things work together toward that. And so that's really where he would come down on that. To him, it was important to say that this was acausal, meaning that we could not readily see the connection as in cause and effect. But again, when you really look at the experiences he had, as well as the experience magicians have, we see where, that big fabric gets tweaked.
Jung also had visions throughout his life, correct?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, a lot of his work really began prior to World War I, when he was seeing, fields of blood, having very dramatic visions of death and such, and he was actually concerned about his well-being. Other times he had, prophetic dreams, various visions, all of which he attributed in this sense of synchronicity. In fact, really, that's sort of the classic model of synchronicity, is a dream like this client and her beetle that then shows up somehow in the manifest world.
My layman's understanding of the collective unconscious was it itself is some kind of magical realm, and that you're kind of pulling from it, and that's where his visions came from, where the occurrence happened with Freud, where the books got thrown off the shelf, and stuff that magnitude. But are you saying that this realm of the collective unconscious isn't something that you could attribute to magic, or at least that Jung didn't attribute to magic?
Well, Jung did not attribute it to magic by any means. But, one of his best descriptions of the collective unconscious, as he understood it, was as if you had a single being with a memory of 2 million years or more. So it is the collective experience and memory of the species, if you will. And depending on how you look at his writings and theories over time, early on, there's this almost desire to say it goes to the DNA. DNA wasn't specifically identified yet, but the idea of genes were. And and he got away from that. And part of the reason is Jung really came to the point of saying psyche is not in us. We are in psyche. So the collective consciousness, the collective unconscious, psyche is this large web, which we all do draw from. It is the origin of dreams. It's the origin of myth. It is the origin of story. Does that help where you're asking? Good, great. You had hand up?
Yeah, I was curious if you could expand on the overlap between the concept of individuation or getting in touch with your like higher self, as I think Jung might have called it, with concepts from ceremonial magic like knowledge and communion of the holy guardian angel. I feel like as I'm reading Crowley and I'm reading Jung, I see a lot of alignment and overlap in those concepts.
Yeah. So Jung's psychology is a psychology of middle age. In general, as we grow up, we are in the midst of ego formation. So parents, teachers, everybody around us is telling us what we ought to be and who we ought to be and how we ought to be. At some point, usually around midlife, we hit a point where that is no longer bearable. And we begin to make changes. And this is something that in Jung's theory, psyche does. Psyche forces upon us. We begin to make these changes toward becoming who we truly are as individuals, who we were truly born to be. And that is the individuation process. It is a lifelong process. It is not a target where you wake up one day and say, I'm an individuated being. If somebody were to say that, I'd be very concerned about them, or I might just chuckle, because it's a lifelong journey. But it is really the unlearning of the ego. It's the process of the ego coming into alignment with what Jung called the self, which was the core and the totality of the personality. So when we talk about things like the HGA, of course, there's, as you know, there's different viewpoints on what the HGA even really is. Jung, if Jung were here today to answer that, he would explain that the self is, number one, the source of what he called the God image. So basically, this thing within us, this central core piece of who we are, is not God, but it's a reflection of whatever we think God is. And we, over human history, have tried to portray that in various images. So, like in our culture, the dominant image is the old white man in a beard and a long white robe in the sky somewhere. Other cultures have had very different dominant God images. The HGA is a God image, if you will. Not to say that it is a God, but it is a reflection of, from Jungian standpoint, it would be a reflection of the self. Now, that's not to say, again, from what I have been putting together and all this, it's not to say that the HGA does not exist. But it may very well be that we create it. That helpful?
Yeah, for sure.
Great. Any other questions? Sure. Oh,
Going back to what you're saying about his idea of the subconscious, did he ever explicitly compare that to analogous things from other cultures or religions or frameworks, or like Ashkatic records or anything like that?
I don't know of any indication of Jung referring to Akashic records. Jung did not consider himself an occultist. And he tried to stay away from a lot of those things. He did, however, talk about the unconscious as the source of all these myths and ideas. For Jung, myth, and I use that word myth broadly, myth was a spontaneous creation of psyche. So where, some of our theorists go back and they say, well, myth is a bunch of ignorant people who couldn't figure out why the sun rose in the morning, and so they had to make a story about it. And that's a perspective. For Jung, myth was something far more important, far more central to who we are. Fairy tales come into the same way. So, for example, you have the story of Snow White, which, when you start really looking at that, is very much a story of a young woman coming into adulthood, and the universal transformation that takes place in that story. And it's why our fairy tales, we're finding out, have roots that are thousands of years old in some cases, because these stories pass down. And if they didn't have that resonance with the collective unconscious, they frankly would not survive. It's that resonance that keeps them relevant to us. Is that getting at what you asked?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Please.
I was curious if you could expand on the Gnosticism of Jung, insofar as it intersects with, things like Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Thelema, etc. Gnosticism, I feel like comes up a lot.
There are far better experts than me on that topic. Yeah, and there are some, there are some great books. One is actually titled The Gnostic Jung. It's not an area that I've had a chance to dig into deeply quite yet. It definitely impacts on this research.
Yeah, I feel like it's going to connect to both the mystic and the psychological a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Please.
So at the tail end of Jung's life, he wrote, a collection of things that came together to be the Red Book. And the Red Book in itself, if you read it's a stark contrast to a lot of his earlier works. It gets into a lot of like deep, confusing, murky waters. Like it's sometimes it's frankly hard to understand. And some of it is really, it's just out there. Do you think somehow the magical influence, the metaphysical influence that you're talking about, led him to the state at the tail end of his life where he I don't want to say devolved, but he moved into this other Jung that allowed him to make the Red Book?
Yeah, not so much, because understand the number one, the Red Book, actually, he completely stopped work on the Red Book quite a while before his death. When he really began to grasp alchemy as a psychological language to help convey his ideas, he stopped his work on the Red Book. The Red Book has its origins from 1913 and 1914. So immediately after he had his falling out with Freud, he went into a state of depression, a state of psychological trauma. And, it's like, you said he had some various visions and such. He finally decided that the only way that he was going to be able to survive this and come out ahead was to really take this as an experiment. And so he writes about how he sat down one night and sunk down into these fantasies, these various images, characters, what have you, that came forward spontaneously in the mind. And he engaged them through what's called active imagination. So active imagination is a process where it's not just a matter of something being imaginary. We talk about it being imaginal, because psychic images have a reality. And like he said, they actually proceed on their own logic. So what will happen is somebody can work in active imagination with a particular image, and they just sink into that and allow that to unfold as it will. Entire conversations take place, which is what the Red Book, is largely made up of, is conversations. So Jung is having these experiences back in 1913 and 1914. He's recording them meticulously in diaries that he calls the Black Books. Later on, he begins to compile them, condense them into the Red Book, and add art, illustrations and such. And part of the reason he does this is because according to him, all of his later theoretical writing has its origins in that experimental period. Because that's when he understood the reality of the psyche and this process of working with the psyche. So, you know, with that background, getting to your question, no, it's really not a late life change. It's something that he has engaged all the way along. But as I was talking to a couple people before this started, you have to understand that Jung wrote about how he realizes as a youth that he had two personalities as he saw it. He had his personality number one that was very much the scientist. He wanted to know how nature worked, and you know, he wanted to learn about medicine. He wanted to learn archaeology. And then he had the aspect of him that he called his personality two. And, you know, many people would call that a mystic, quite honestly. It was something that unnerved him, partly because his mother was very psychic. And so when he saw that personality two in himself, it made him nervous because his mother, frankly, kind of scared him in that respect. So in a lot of ways, Jung's entire life and work is trying to find the balance, the meeting place between that personality one and personality two. The other aspect of it is honestly a political and academic situation that he was in. You know, Freud is credited with being the inventor, quote unquote, of psychoanalysis. And he was Jewish. He was not a believer, but he was very, very afraid that people would reject his theories because of him being Jewish. He was afraid that people would call it a Jewish psychology. So when Jung began to work with him, he was very excited. He referred to Jung as his crown prince, because here's this Swiss gentleman who, you know, doesn't have the burden of being Jewish in an anti-Semitic culture. So together, they are being careful in how they present things because they want to be taken seriously by scientists and empiricists. It ends up being part of what splits them apart because Jung cannot escape the fact that that spirituality, religion, the numinous, as it was called, was an important part of the psyche. To Freud, it was garbage. It was useless material. Jung felt that we needed to understand myth and story and religion in order to understand the psyche. And like I said, you know, Freud called that a spook complex. The irony is Freud was secretly doing his own writing on the occult that he did not allow to be published until after his death. So, but again, it's because of the political climate of the day, and they're trying to establish a new discipline that they want to gain respect. So they're very worried about how it's received. Please.
I'm curious if you've thought about how Jung has influenced modern magicians. Like you talked a little bit about it with Crowley. I feel like every time I read a book written in the last century on magic, I'm keeping a mental count of like, when do I hit Jung? And I'll announce it to my wife. I'm like, oh, page 18, here he is. So I'm just curious, like, if there are practices or things that you've identified that have clear Jungian roots. Like some of the things that jump to my mind are the concept of like path working. I think path working is a somewhat new thing. I think it was like the first published thing was like 2014. And I'm just like, this is just active imagination. You know,
It really is.
Yeah.
But then again, understand that it's also Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in some Kabbalistic writings, what is really described as going on with the prophets and such is what Jung would call active imagination. Henry Corbin, who is a marvelous scholar of Islam, really dug into this. And he referred to as, he's the one who really coined the word the imaginal as opposed to imaginary. Because he argued that we have to take the imaginal as a reality. We have to treat it seriously. And in our culture today, we've gone so far that the pendulum has swung so much toward the scientific method that we reject other ways of knowing. I teach psychological research to students, and I'm constantly having to work with them because to them, if you can't hook up a meter to it and count it, it's not real. They don't understand that, there's a whole lot of the human psyche that you can't count, that you can't measure in that sort of way. And so we get into experience, we get into emotion, we get into feeling. So I end up, and I teach both aspects of research, and my students prepare, a capstone project that they design. And invariably, I'll have at least one student, almost always male, who will just dig their heels in because they're so convinced that the only real knowledge is what they can get from experimental research. But Henry Corbin talked about this idea that the imaginal has to be taken seriously. Our indigenous cultures take it seriously. That in some of our indigenous cultures, the dream world is considered more real than our waking world. And so, I'm probably ranging a little bit from your question here, but as I read a lot of writings of modern magicians, like I said, I see this argument going on where so many of them want to do an either or. And because of it, some of them get really irritated with Jung because they mistakenly think that Jung completely reduced it to aspects of psyche. Well, yes, in some of these writings for public consumption, he did. That certainly can be seen. But, modern Jungian scholars, those who have followed Jung and done more work, would not say that at all. Modern Jungian scholars would say, as I did, the answer is yes, it's both. The reality is, as I meet you here tonight, I cannot possibly know the real you. I know my idea of who you are, and vice versa. Because I see you through my lenses, you see me through your lenses. We project on each other the aspects of ourselves that we don't necessarily admire or that we don't take credit for. So we are continually in this place of projection in the world. And so when we are working with spirit entities, the place I am coming to in my understanding and bringing this all together is sort of why I go back to like the corpus hermeticum and these myths, because we are creative beings. When I was doing my dissertation work, I was doing research on 36,000-year-old cave art. And one of the images that I worked with had a human figure with the head of a bison. And I was doing all this active imagination work with the images, following Jung's example. And I got to this particular image, and the impression I had was, hold on, there's different ways of entering into active imagination. I said, hold on, you need to actually invoke here. You need to actually invoke spirits that are associated with this image. And, at the time I thought, okay, well, that's kind of weird. And I reached out to, I think I may have even talked to Steve about it at the time. I talked to a lot of magicians at the time and kind of got their 2 cents worth. And, I was like, okay, for one thing, how do I invoke a spirit whose name I don't know from 36,000 years ago? Just for starters, But I used, a very standard Trithemian invocation with this particular image. And in my experience of the active imagination, this figure came very much to life and interacted with me, very much as I would experience a spirit in an invocation. Whether that spirit existed 10 minutes before my ritual, I don't know. I don't care. Because I think it's just as likely that in conjuring that spirit, I created that spirit. That does not make it any less real. That spirit still provided me insights that had not come to me prior. And so, I don't pretend to have all the answers here, but in my experience thus far, I think we have to take our role as creative beings seriously. And magic is part of that. As magicians, we're really well poised to do that.
Interestingly, that reminds me of American Gods a little bit.
Mhm.
Almost sort of stands in contrast to Gaiman's thought, right? Of like the concept of the gods dying.
Mhm.
And sort of what you're getting at is that they almost can't. And I think that it kind of, to me, reminds me of the fact that Jung thought about the collective unconscious as existing outside of the time stream, right? And so in our reality, sure, that God has been quote unquote dead for 36,000 years. But the reality is that everything that ever happened is all happening at once.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
are they really
Yeah.
dead, or are you just still reaching out to that same thing that
Well,
exists, right?
well,
Yeah.
So take Gaiman to his conclusion, because I don't want to make spoilers here. Steve?
Oh, I was gonna say, kind of the side question being how has Jung influenced magic, and my Jungian, my very first encounter with this guy named Jung was through the concept of the archetype, which we really use, and you touched on it in a lot of different ways without actually saying archetype.
Right.
But yeah, that basically comes down to it. It's drawing from that archetype, from the collecting. That basically allows you to take something as preposterous as Simon's Necronomicon and have success with
Exactly.
it. You're
Yes.
doing this, it's pulling from an archetype that already exists.
Yes.
And I think that truly that, to me, in my practice, few decades, that's mostly what I've drawn from is that study.
Yeah.
Without ever actually doing it.
No, that's very well put. Absolutely. It really is. Gaiman, at one point in the book makes it really clear that a god may die, but that God shows up again. And there's an instance in the book where a god has died and shows up again in another form and claims to be that being. And the person the main character has interacted with the earlier version is like, no, you don't look anything like him. And he says, well, I am him, but he wasn't me. The idea being that this God, this image, manifests in different ways. And in this case, it's Odin. It's saying, that, your Odin is not my Odin. So like Steve's saying, we are talking about archetypal energies, but we're also talking about these ideas that have been built upon. I'm a polytheist, unashamed. And I am really happy to work with divine beings, whether they be gods, angels, demons, whatever, that have been, legendary for hundreds and thousands of years, because I know people have been pouring energy into them. And so they're going to be powerful tools. Please.
You said you're a polytheist. So in one of Jung's most famous books, I don't think it's directly written by him, it's written by Jungians, but man and his symbols.
Mhm.
He talks about how all throughout history there have been reoccurring symbols, reoccurring gods, and he says that they're coming from similar places. So for you as a polytheist, do you think a lot of these deities, entities that you are worshiping or whatever you're doing, whatever your magic practices, are stemming from that place that Jung says they are stemming from?
Yeah, that's fair to say. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I happen to have a master's in spiritual guidance, and I work with individual clients who are on their own spiritual journey. And whatever their tradition is, I work with them as they explore that. And, one of the things I say when I talk with them is, the divine, whatever that is, wears 1,000 masks. We give it images so that we can focus somehow on that image or that aspect of the divine that we're working with, whatever the case may be. Jung said that anything we're conscious of is image, and image is psyche. So we cannot conceive of the divine or anything else without images. And this means that we continually come back. We're always creating images so that we can then have some kind of interaction there. Steve, you said there was an online question?
Yep.
Oh, okay. All right. Anybody else? Thank you all for your patience tonight, for being here. I really appreciate being able to, to present some of this to you. Like I said, it's continual work in progress, and I've appreciated the questions and given me more avenues for thought, and look forward to doing more. Thank you.
Sure.